controversy of Judah and Jerusalem, the most important and controversial questions in the world. Israel continues construction in the West Bank, riots on the Temple Mount, the brutal murder of an Israeli yeshiva student. Israel mourns the destruction of the first and second temples on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the month Av. It's all happening this week in Israel. Welcome to Bible in the News. This is David Billington. Temple Mount riots remind us how delicate the situation can be in Israel and where the center of the conflict lies. The Remembrance Day of Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temples confirm that the center of the conflict is the Temple Mount, then Jerusalem, and then the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria. The newly approved construction in Judea and the international reaction, and the brutal murder of the yeshiva student in Gush Etzion, just south of Jerusalem, in Judea, remind us of this. As it says in the prophet Joel, "For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land." In this passage in the prophecy of Joel, the regathering of the Jewish people to Judah and Jerusalem is directly connected with the gathering of the nations to Armageddon. Again this week, we see a clear demonstration that this is not just a local flashpoint, but an international one. Israeli construction in Judea and Samaria. The civil administration in Israel advanced plans for about 2,000 homes in the areas of Judea and Samaria, called by many outside Israel as the West Bank. The administration also approved a plan for 6,000 housing units. However, no details of the plan were made public. The proposed construction was subsequently slammed by the United Nations and the European Union. The Israeli left-wing paper Haaretz reported, UN slams Israel's effective annexation of West Bank after 2,000 settlement units approved. There is no question that this is an international issue, just as the prophet Joel prophesied so many centuries ago. On the Times of Israel website, there was a report this Saturday, August 10th, concerning the U.S. peace envoy to the region, Jason Greenblatt's comments about there not being an international consensus on the Mideast conflict. Back in July, Jason Greenblatt delivered a fiery speech in New York at the Security Council, in which he lambasted what he called fictions of international consensus on the conflict, including that the Palestinians were entitled to a capital in East Jerusalem. As a result, he faced criticism from the German ambassador to the UN regarding his comments and the whole American approach to the Mideast conflict, saying that Washington had left the international consensus. This Friday, he shot back at the German ambassador, saying,
"Let me get a little specific here. This conflict will not end on the basis of an international consensus about who is right and who is wrong, about who should give up X and who should give up Y. International consensus might work from time to time when you could actually achieve an international consensus. In the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, international consensus had not been achieved. Those who continue to call for international consensus on this conflict are doing nothing to encourage the parties to sit down at the negotiating table and make the hard compromises necessary for peace. In fact, they are doing the opposite, allowing people to hide behind words that mean nothing. International consensus is too often nothing more than a mask for inaction. Let us not forget the day when the United Nations could not even find a way to build an international consensus behind the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization that relentlessly attacks Israelis by incendiary balloons, missiles, attack tunnels, and other means, sometimes while hiding in residential neighborhoods filled with Palestinian families. Hamas, which ghoulishly holds Israeli soldiers Hadar Golden and Oran Shaul as bargaining chips. Hamas, which imprisons Israeli civilians Avraham Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed. Hamas, a brutal terrorist organization that causes nothing but misery and suffering for Palestinians and Israelis, an organization that continues to vow to destroy Israel. This failure is profoundly shameful. If we cannot even find an international consensus regarding Hamas, is an international consensus really going to end this conflict? And how is it that we can't find an international consensus that the Palestinian Authority rewarding terrorism and the murder of Israelis using public funds, some donated by the countries in this very room, is abhorrent and must be stopped? International consensus is not international law, so let's stop kidding ourselves. If a so-called international consensus had been able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it would have done so decades ago. It didn't. This conflict is also not going to be resolved by reference to international law, when such law is inconclusive. We have all heard cogent arguments claiming international law says one thing or another about this or that aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some of those arguments are persuasive, at least to certain audiences, but none of them are conclusive. We will not get to the bottom of whose interpretation of international law is correct on this conflict. There is no judge, jury, or court in the world that the parties involved have agreed to give jurisdiction in order to decide whose interpretations are correct. International law with respect to this conflict is a tricky subject that could be discussed and argued for years without ever reaching a conclusion. So we can spend years and years arguing what the law is and whether it is enforceable and prolong the ongoing suffering, or we could acknowledge the futility of that approach. This conflict will also not be resolved by constantly referencing the hundreds of UN resolutions on the issue. The constant reference to these heavily negotiated, purposely ambiguously worded resolutions is nothing more than a cloak to avoid substantive debate about the realities on the ground and the complexity of the conflict. The interpretation of one of the most often cited resolutions, Resolution 242, has been hotly debated over the past half-century. That debate has not brought us closer to a lasting and comprehensive peace. That debate has not even bridged the gap between those who construe Resolution 242 to call for the so-called right of return and compensation for displaced Palestinians, and the fact that the world covers its eyes to the fate of the roughly equal number of Jews who were expelled or forced to flee their homes in Arab countries in connection with Israel's War of Independence. Resolution 242 and others may have been drafted and voted upon in a genuine attempt to bring an end to the suffering that all involved in this conflict had endured. But we must acknowledge they have not succeeded. A comprehensive and lasting peace will not be created by fiat of international law or by these heavily wordsmithed, unclear resolutions. The same holds true for the status of Jerusalem. There is no international consensus about Jerusalem, and no international consensus or interpretation of international law will persuade the United States or Israel that a city in which Jews have lived and worshipped for nearly 3,000 years and has been the capital of the Jewish state for 70 years is not today and forever the capital of Israel.
Just as we would expect from the prophets, we have Europe and Russia supporting the Palestinian cause and the United States on the opposite side. The center of the conflict is the Temple Mount, Jerusalem, and the biblical heartland of Judah and Jerusalem. Along with the new proposed construction in the contested areas, the Jerusalem Post reported that 4 outpost settlements were to be officially approved by the government. The 4 outposts to be approved as neighborhoods of existing settlements are Bnei Hanachel, Givat Shalit, Haroi HaIvri, and Brosh. Last year, while in Israel, I happened to visit Ibnei Hanachel, which is right next to the Land of Israel Network Farm. This is an amazing and strategic area, deep in Judea, with views of the Dead Sea. In fact, the most easterly Jewish settlement in the area. It sits right next to Tekoa, where the Hebrew prophet Amos was from. It is on the edge of the wilderness of Ziph, where David fled from Saul. one cannot deny the Hebrew-Jewish connection to this land. 98 of the new homes to be built are in the neighboring community of Ma'ale Amos, named after the prophet Amos. All 4 of the approved communities are strategic in nature, deep into the contested areas of Judea and Samaria. Peace Now, an Israeli organization funded in a large part by foreign European governments, which monitors Israeli construction in contested areas, recognized the significance of this latest move by Israel, stating that approvals such as this latest one could make partitioning the West Bank under a future peace deal with the Palestinians practically impossible. These controversial and momentous questions regarding Jerusalem and Judah continue to be a sensitive and volatile international issue. This was seen beforehand by the Light of Scripture by John Thomas in a booklet later republished as Exposition of Daniel. Here he stated, while looking forward to when the breakers of Judah would themselves be broken, that the time, however, fast approaches, and the nearer it arrives, the more important do all questions become, bearing upon Judah's land and Zion, the city of their king. The time has definitely come when the questions bearing upon Judah's land and Zion, the city of their king, are the most important questions agitated in the world. Come back next week, God willing, to www.bibleinthenews.com.